Look, the XRP chart is currently in a position where acting as though nothing is wrong is a certain way to be caught off guard. This isn't one of those informal settings where a tiny candle print makes no difference. This is a pressure point, I guess. You're essentially walking about blindfolded if you're not paying attention to the levels we're going to discuss. The majority of the market is doing precisely that, which is annoying. They chase the momentum, wake up only after the move has already occurred, and then pretend astonished when they become stuck in the incorrect direction. Therefore, grasp one item before proceeding. The background noise you are currently viewing on XRP is not typical. This is a significant turning point with actual repercussions. However, before diving right into the chart, you should be aware of some developments surrounding Bitcoin, as they are closely related to the macro environment that XRP is set to move within. And whether people like to acknowledge it or not, the story of Bitcoin is finally being put to the test in a way that it has never had to before. Specifically, I'm referring to the findings that link a specific person, the face you saw on the screen, to the early stages of Bitcoin development. I won't reveal the identity because it seems like YouTube randomly punishes you for talking about inappropriate topics. However, you've already seen who it was. The market was rocked by that story as soon as it broke, and most people are too afraid to discuss it publicly. This is the unpleasant reality. The entire branding of Bitcoin has relied on the notion that it was developed by nobody, that its anonymity is a strength, and that it appeared out of thin air as this flawless, decentralized gift to humanity. It seems ridiculous when you say it out, yet for more than 10 years, that is the real way the story has been marketed. Without a doubt, someone invented Bitcoin. The code was written by someone. The first coins were mined by someone. The choices were made by someone. And the early supply is still under someone's control. Acting otherwise is denial, not decentralization. There are two ways to look at this. The sentimental, idealistic perspective of the majority of Bitcoin. Maximalists hold on. Decentralization must make it irrelevant if we don't know who made it. You might also consider it from the perspective of real institutions. Any possibility, including some really troublesome ones, is possible if you don't know who made it. Because they are aware of how flimsy the narrative becomes the moment you acknowledge that uncertainty affects both parties, the Bitcoin crowd steers clear of that section at all costs. The reality is straightforward. If the public found out who the true creator was, specifically, someone connected to an adversarial government, someone with fingerprints from intelligence services, and someone whose goals do not coincide with those of investors, what the network, the code, or the textbooks say is irrelevant. Confidence breaks out. Institutions retreat. The store panics. Logic is not the basis for market movement. They proceed with psychology. Furthermore, psychology destroys assets more quickly than any technical defect. In the meantime, Bitcoiners are living under the delusion that the best-case scenario is certain. They believe the creator was a kind genius who left the world with a flawless digital reserve asset before vanishing into the sunset. Ike, that's not analysis. Wishful narrative, that is. Additionally, wishful thinking is penalized while working with a trillion-dollar asset. This is the portion that most people overlook. XRP is not covered by this complete risk profile. The project was designed with transparency in mind from the start. Additionally, you are at least aware of the founders' identities and what they constructed and why. The market that matters doesn't have a mysterious boogeyman ready to blow up the place, particularly for organizations that detest unknowns. And that's precisely where things begin to change, because it alters your perspective on what's occurring on the XRP chart once you realize how flimsy the narrative surrounding Bitcoin is at the moment. Speaking of which, you need to pay attention to what that chart is flashing. When you take a step back and examine the psychology surrounding Bitcoin at the moment, you begin to see how much of its value has been supported by a myth that everyone has decided not to believe. Query. Investors believed the creator to be impartial or at least a decent person. They believed there would never be any movement of those early coins. They believed that purity somehow equated to anonymity. However, markets don't always reward presumptions. The assets with the weakest foundations are the first to crumble when reality finally arrives. That's the part that people don't want to consider rationally. The moment the inventor is discovered to be someone who is hated by half of the populace and revered by the other half, political instability. The market is permanently shadowed by the supply overhang if it turns out that the person holding the million coins is still alive. And the psychological premium that Bitcoin has relied on for 10 years quickly vanishes if it turns out to be someone who is genuinely problematic and someone who institutions would never want to be associated with. You can keep arguing that the code is now decentralized. However, investors are not like mathematicians. They act like prejudiced, fearful, and emotionally sensitive people. The fact that Bitcoin's purported greatest advantage, anonymity, may also be its biggest drawback. Adds to the irony of the whole scenario. Everyone is forced to impose their own presumptions onto an asset when its origins are unknown. The best case scenario is what optimists project. Realists are aware that the worst case scenario is always a possibility in the unknown. Furthermore, institutions don't operate on any presumptions. They require transparency, predictability, and clarity. They want to be certain of what they are purchasing into. That's why the market was so affected by this recent report. It creates uncertainty. The one thing that Bitcoin has never been priced for is doubt. In the meantime, none of that affects XRP. It was built by someone you know. It was built for a reason you know. You are familiar with the framework of governance. You are aware of the reasons, the background, and the development. You're not holding out for a shadowy character to reappear and possibly blow up the market. Because it seems less mysterious than Bitcoin, people enjoy acting as though knowing the founders is a drawback. However, that is precisely the kind of reasoning that succeeds in the retail sector, but fails when institutions intervene with actual funding. Ghosts are not wanted by institutions. They desire traceability and responsibility. And identification isn't the only factor. It has to do with rewards. The inventor of Bitcoin is in possession of a vast amount. The founders of XRP do not face the same asymmetric threat to the asset. Early Bitcoin mining concentrations led to structural flaws. That same time bomb isn't a part of XRP's distribution. Most significantly, at a time when global liquidity is limited and macro pressure is increasing, Bitcoin is currently the target of a narrative onslaught. The worst time to induce doubt is at that moment. In contrast, XRP is about to enter a phase in which clarity is growing rather than declining. When you combine all of it, the image becomes clear. The asset that is currently carrying, while the asset that was targeted for years is finally shedding doubt, uncertainty is becoming more and more. Markets are concerned about that change, whether or not people want to embrace it. They've always done so. And that leads us to something more concrete, something that can be measured rather than merely speculated about. Because XRP's chart is displaying behavior that completely contradicts the market's concern, while Bitcoin's story is shaky. Upon closer inspection, XRP is actually maintaining a level that has no business remaining unless something more significant is developing beneath the surface. Since the price action is providing a far clearer picture than the surrounding noise, let's move on to the technical side of things. And the next significant action is determined by the levels we are currently reaching. This is when things start to get interesting. And to be honest, most retail traders completely lose their mind at this stage. They never zoom out to see what's really tightening behind the scenes, instead continuing to stare at XRP's daily chart as if it were some kind of big revelation. Additionally, you are essentially choosing to remain blind if you continue to do that.